The property I am talking about is 42 acres in the Blue Ridge foothills of western North Carolina. My family has owned it since 1961. I grew up on it. My children grew up on it. My grandchildren visited every summer and have been visiting it every summer since they could walk. I know this land, or I believed I knew it, which turns out to be a different thing entirely. What I am about to share with you is not the account of a single dramatic encounter. It is not the account of one extraordinary morning or one terrifying night that changed everything. What I am sharing is the account of a slow, accumulating, retrospective realization, the specific experience of looking back across 30 years of recorded observations and understanding, with the clarity that hindsight provides and the discomfort that comes with it, that something has been sharing this land with my family for the entirety of my adult life. Not visiting, not passing through, here, present across seasons and decades, in proximity to a house where 4 generations of my family have eaten breakfast and argued about television and gone to bed without any awareness that the land around them was more occupied than they knew. I am 61 years old. I am a retired county agricultural extension agent. For 30 years, my professional work involved the systematic observation and documentation of land and its biological contents across a region of western North Carolina. And I maintained the same habits on my own 42 acres that I maintained professionally. I kept records, notebooks first, and then digital files after 2005, seasonal observations of wildlife, plant community changes, soil condition, water table variation, the kind of record that anyone who has worked in agricultural extension for 3 decades keeps because it is professionally habitual and personally satisfying. In the winter of 2022, during a period when my wife was recovering from surgery and I was spending more time at home than usual, I read through all 30 years of those records in sequence. What I found, what the records revealed when read as a complete document rather than as individual annual entries, was the most unsettling thing I have ever encountered in a life that has not been short on surprises. I want to describe the process of reading those 30 years of records because the process is as important as the content. I began with the earliest notebooks, spring of 1992, when I had just turned 30 and had moved back to the property after my wife and I decided we wanted to raise our children on the land I had grown up on. The early records were dense with the observations of a young man who was paying attention to everything. Every species of bird noted by date of first spring sighting, every unusual plant community feature, every anomalous wildlife observation. In April of 1993, I noted large unidentified tracks in the soft mud along the upper creek bank, too large for any dog I know of in the county. Photographed. Bears possible, but unusual at this elevation in April. I had not thought about that entry in 29 years. I continued reading. In August of 1994, something disturbed the corn at the field's upper edge. Not deer sign, wrong height, wrong damage pattern, checked for bear. No other bear sign in the area. In March of 1997, unusual vocalization mid-evening from the direction of the upper woodlot. Not an owl, not a coyote, not anything I can identify. Duration approximately 10 seconds. Single occurrence. In July of 2001, strong, unfamiliar scent near the old spring house. 'Organic, dense. Not skunk, not fox, not deer, not anything I can identify. Duration approximately 10 seconds. Single occurrence. In July of 2001, strong, unfamiliar scent near the old spring house. Organic, dense. Not skunk, not fox, not deer, not anything I can identify. Duration approximately 10 seconds. Single occurrence. not anything in my reference, persisted for 2 days. The entries were distributed across the decades with a consistency that I did not appreciate until I read them as a sequence. Every 1 to 3 years across the full 30-year span, I had noted something that I had at the time attributed to unknown cause or to a familiar species behaving unexpectedly, and had then moved on to the next observation without accumulating them into a pattern. Because each individual entry was explicable in isolation. Unusual tracks, possibly a very large dog from a neighboring property, crop disturbance at an unusual height, possibly a bear passing through, unidentified vocalization, possibly a species I was unfamiliar with, unfamiliar scent, possibly a wildlife species with a scent signature I had not previously encountered. Read in isolations, each entry had an innocent explanation. Read in sequence, 30 years of innocent explanations produced a pattern that had no innocent explanation. Something had been on this property consistently across 30 years, and I had been recording its presence in the careful professional habit of a man who documented what he observed without knowing what he was documenting. I spent the better part of January and February of 2022 doing something I had never done with my own records. I built a timeline. I extracted every anomalous observation from the 30 years of notebooks and digital files, every entry that I had flagged at the time as unusual, unidentified, or unexplained, and I arranged them chronologically and mapped them geographically on an aerial image of the property. The timeline contained 47 entries across 30 years. Not every year had an entry. 7 years in the sequence were blank. The remaining 23 years had between 1 and 4 entries each. The geographic mapping was more revealing than the timeline alone. The entries were not distributed randomly across the 42 acres. They clustered in 3 specific areas: the upper woodlot, approximately 8 acres of old-growth mixed hardwood in the property's northeast corner, the creek drainage that ran along the property's eastern boundary, and the area around the old spring house, a stone structure built in the 1890s that my family had used for cold storage before refrigeration, and that had been unused since the 1960s. 3 areas over 30 years, with a consistency of clustering that was inconsistent with random wildlife movement and consistent with habitual, repeated use of specific locations. The old spring house in particular, I counted 11 separate entries in 30 years that referenced anomalous observations within or immediately adjacent to the spring house. 11 in 30 years, distributed across the full span. The spring house had been producing anomalous observations at an average of 1 every 3 years for as long as I had been keeping records. This gradually revealed something profoundly disturbing about a place I thought I knew. The spring house was not simply a historic structure on my family's property. It was, by the weight of 30 years of consistent evidence, a location that something found useful and returned to, with a frequency that my records had been faithfully documenting without my understanding what they were documenting. On a clear February morning in 2022, I walked to the spring house for the first time in approximately 10 years. Not because I had avoided it, simply because it had become part of the property's background, a feature that I passed occasionally and noted without engaging with. I engaged with it. The spring house is a structure approximately 12 by 16 feet, built into the hillside above the property's main spring with a stone foundation and a timber frame upper structure that has been in declining condition since before I was born. The interior is divided by a stone-lined channel through which the spring water runs, keeping the interior cold. Access is through a door on the south face, which has been without a working latch since the 1980s and can be pushed open from either side. I pushed it open and went in. The interior smell was the first thing, dense, organic, the specific combination that I had recorded in 11 separate entries across 30 years, and had each time attributed to unfamiliar wildlife or to the spring house's cold, damp interior chemistry. Familiar now, in a way it had not been in previous visits. I had spent the preceding 2 months reading accounts of Bigfoot encounters, and the scent description in those accounts was consistent enough across narrators to constitute a reference point. The spring house smelled like those accounts described. The physical evidence was more specific. In the interior's driest corner, against the stone foundation wall opposite the spring channel, the accumulated debris of decades of disuse, leaves, twigs, the organic material that enters a structure with open access across 60 years of abandonment, had been disturbed. Not simply disturbed, organized, cleared from the corner itself, pushed to the margins, in the specific pattern of a space that has been prepared for use rather than incidentally disturbed. And against the stone wall of the prepared corner, at a height of approximately 5.5 feet, a mark. The same pigment application mark that I have now read, described in multiple accounts of these beings' use of structures and trees. A repeated element pattern in a dark mineral pigment applied to the stone surface with enough pressure to have penetrated the surface slightly. I had been in the spring house a dozen times in the preceding decade. I had not seen this mark before. Either I had not looked at the right height, or the mark was recent. Either possibility was significant. I want to sit with the question that the 47 entries in the spring house visit and the 3 decades of consistent geographic clustering raised for me, and that I have been sitting with for the 2 years since February 2022. The question is not, what was on my property for 30 years? The record answers that question as clearly as any record I can construct from available evidence. Something large, bipedal, intelligent, leaving specific kinds of sign in specific locations with consistent frequency across 3 decades. The record is what it is. The question is, what does 30 years of cohabitation, shared occupancy of the same 42 acres by my family and by something else that my family was not aware of, mean for how I understand what that time was? Here's why this changed everything for my understanding of home and wild. Home, for me, has always meant the 42 acres, the specific land, the upper woodlot and the creek drainage and the old spring house and the kitchen garden and the field where my children played and where my grandchildren play now. I have organized my sense of place, my sense of belonging, my sense of what home means around this specific piece of ground for 61 years. The ground was already someone else's home when I was using it as mine. Not exclusively. I am not claiming that the 42 acres belong to this being the way a territory belongs to a solitary predator. The evidence suggests use, consistent use, habitual return to specific sites, but not exclusive occupancy. We were cohabiting, my family on the surface, carrying out the ordinary life of a rural family across 30 years, planting and harvesting and raising children and keeping records and sitting on the porch watching the evening light on the Blue Ridge foothills. And something else in the corners we weren't attending to, in the upper woodlot on the winter nights when we were indoors, in the creek drainage on the early mornings when we hadn't yet come outside, in the old spring house that nobody was using, and that something apparently was. The thing that disturbs me most is not the presence itself. It is the restraint. Whatever was using this land for 30 years had every opportunity to make itself known to us. The property is 42 acres. The distances involved are small. 4 generations of my family have been on this land, in the fields and the woodlot, and along the creek, at every hour and in every season. Whatever shared this land with us was present often enough to appear in my records 17 times, and to leave consistent sign in 3 geographic clusters. It had the intelligence, by the evidence of its behavior in those locations, to understand what the structures on the property were for and to use them. And across 30 years, it never made itself known to us. Not by accident, with the deliberate, sustained practice discipline of something that had decided, for reasons I can only infer but not confirm, that its continued use of this land required our continued unawareness of it. It managed us with more sophistication and more patience than we managed ourselves. I told my wife in March of 2022, we have been married for 37 years. She is a practical woman who grew up on a farm and who has, across 37 years of marriage to me, developed a well-calibrated tolerance for my professional habit of finding significance in things that the untrained eye passes over. She listened to the full account, the timeline, the geographic clusters, the spring house, the marks on the stone wall. She asked 3 questions. How long did I think it had been going on? Had it ever done anything threatening? And did I want to do anything about it? I said, at least 30 years, possibly longer, possibly since before my parents bought the land in 1961. I said no. Nothing threatening in 30 years of recorded presence. Not one entry in the full 47 that suggested threat or aggression toward any member of my family. Every entry was either sign in unoccupied areas or anomalous observations from a distance. I said, I did not know. She said, then I think we leave it alone. It's been leaving us alone. This is the conclusion I have arrived at as well, and I want to describe why it is not simply an avoidance of the question, but an affirmative answer to it. The 30 years of cohabitation produced no harm to my family. The thing that has been on this land has not been in the house, has not been near the children or the grandchildren in any way that produced any incident, has not interfered with the farming operation or the garden or any of the ordinary activities of family life on 42 acres. The cohabitation has been for 30 years genuinely two groups sharing a space, each using what they need from it, neither group impeding the other's use. If that is what it has been, and the record suggests that it has been, then changing it seems like the worst option. The dynamic that has existed for 30 years, in which something intelligent and capable and unknown has chosen consistently to share this land without conflict, is a dynamic that deserves to be continued rather than disrupted. We leave it alone, and it leaves us alone. And the 42 acres contains both of us, as it apparently has for at least as long as my family has been on it. I keep records differently since February of 2022. Not more extensively, I have always been thorough, but with different attention. I go to the upper woodlot more often than I did before, not looking for anything specific, but paying the quality of attention that I now understand the upper woodlot deserves. I walk along the creek drainage in the early morning sometimes, with the specific, unhurried, peripheral attentiveness that 30 years of agricultural observation has built in me, and that I now apply to a different kind of observation than I was trained for. I check the spring house twice a year, spring and fall. The mark on the stone wall is still there. The corner has been prepared and re-prepared, the debris cleared each time I visit and present again the following season in the cycle that regular use produces. The scent is present in spring, diminished in fall, present again the following spring. Whoever uses the spring house is still using it. The pattern that my 30 years of records described is continuing into its 32nd and 33rd year. The cohabitation continues. What most people don't understand about the question in this script's title is that it is the wrong question. The question is not, could Bigfoot have been here for years? The question, for anyone with 30 years of records and an old spring house and 3 geographic clusters of unexplained observations, is, how many years? And what does that mean for everything you thought you knew about the place you call home? For me, at least 30 years, possibly 60 or more, possibly since before my family arrived on this land. And what it means is that home is larger than I knew, and more inhabited and more complex in its occupancy, and that the land I have been tending for 30 years has been tending something back, providing the shelter and the resource and the consistency of environment that something else has been depending on, quietly and without announcement, across the full span of my adult life. The answer to the question is yes. Bigfoot has been here for years. My records say so. My spring house says so. And the quality of the cohabitation across 30 years of recorded evidence says something about the nature of these beings that I find more significant than any single dramatic encounter could have said. They are not visitors. They are neighbors, and they have been better neighbors across 30 years of sharing this land than I had any idea they were being.